We're so thrilled to have everybody here for our second in-person talk for the Salisbury Forum since 2020. And anyway, I'm Mary Close Oppenheimer, president of the Salisbury Forum. And I just want to ask everyone, with COVID cases increasing, please make sure both your nose and your mouth are covered by your masks. So, due to term limits, this will be my last opportunity to host Salisbury Forum talks. I've loved my 6 years on the board, and I'm happy to let you know that Pat Jenny, one of our board members, will be taking over for me as president. And I am confident that the forum will continue to thrive under her leadership, so our talks will continue. On a very sad note, Donald Ross, my predecessor as president, passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was a great president, but more importantly, a remarkable man who spent his life fighting for good causes. He will, both here and nationally, he will be sorely missed by everyone who knew him. On September 16th, this is news of today, as part of the Lakeville Journal's 125th anniversary celebration, the forum will host a panel discussion on the future of American journalism, and it will be in the newly renovated auditorium at the Hotchkiss School. Brian Ross, investigative journalist and member of the board of the foundation, will moderate. Among the panelists will be Martin Barron, who recently retired as executive editor of the Washington Post. You won't want to miss this conversation. Please remember that all of our talks are available on our website under videos. So if you miss any, or if your friends want to watch it, they just have to go to our website, which is www.salisburyforum.org. On behalf of our board, I want to thank everyone in our audience, as well as local organizations and local businesses who've been supporting us for the past 17 years. Without all of you, our free programs could not exist. We're extremely grateful to the Housatonic Valley Regional High School, Salisbury School, and the Hotchkiss School for hosting our events. Aside from giving us a free venue, a donation of time and effort by their staffs has been extraordinary. We want to particularly thank Principal Ian Strever, Vance Cannon, Julie Lang, and Kevin Wheeler here at Housatonic Valley Regional High School for their amazing efforts to make it possible for us to be here tonight. Thanks also to Connecticut Humanities, and for tonight's program, William Pitt Sotheby's International Realty, who have generously sponsored the part of the cost of this talk. As a special treat, they've donated book bags for our audience. As you leave, you can pick up one in the lobby while they last. So thank you, William Pitt Sotheby's. We really appreciate your generosity. Oblong Books will have copies of Marie Yovanovitch's new book, Lessons from the Edge, with a signed bookplate in the lobby for you to purchase after the event. If you would like to supplement your reading, the Scoville Library will be featuring a short list of titles that she's recommended. We feel more than honored to have Ambassador Yovanovitch with us here tonight. As we know now, she was a longtime Foreign Service officer who served with distinction under 6 administrations, both Democratic and Republican. Of course, her last post was as our ambassador to Ukraine. I assume everyone in this room sat mesmerized in 2019 as she testified during Trump's first impeachment trial. Her patriotism, integrity, and honesty during her 33 years working for our Foreign Service was never questioned. At the time, we could not have imagined the Ukrainian tragedy that is unfolding now. Ambassador Yovanovitch credits her parents for teaching her the values of freedom and democracy, which the U.S. represents. They had survived poverty, war, and displacement after fleeing the Russians and then the Nazis during the Second World War. After first emigrating to Canada, they arrived in the U.S. when Marie was 3 years old, when her father was offered a teaching position at the nearby Kent School. She grew up there, which is why she still has a connection to the school, and why, in arranging tonight's talk, she asked to have Larry Rand be her interviewer. He was chair of the Kent School History Department for 18 years, was friendly with her parents, and was her first history teacher. Yeah, it's close to home. She says he sparked her love of history and foreign policy, which had a big impact on her life and career, obviously. Many of us know Larry as both a beloved member of our community and for his current role as program director and teacher at the Taconic Learning Center. We're so very, very lucky to have them both here tonight. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Yovanovitch and Larry Rand to the Salisbury Forum.
Masha, it is wonderful to be back with you again. You were an exceptional history student at Kent School, and I was really fortunate to be able to work with you in 2 of my classes. And here we are, waiting eagerly to hear your observations on history and your wisdom about diplomacy and much, much more. So let's start with Ukraine, Russia, and related issues. After that, we'll talk about your wonderful book. Okay. So, let's start with the issue of Russia and the West. How do you...
The easy one first.
It appears to me that Russia has for a long time taken a defensive position towards Western Europe. Do you agree?
Offensive?
Defensive.
Defensive.
There have been invasions of Russia by Western European nations, which has prompted a kind of a fear of Western Europe. Is that a fair comment?
It could be, but I mean, Russia is also an historically expansionist country and has also pushed outward to protect Moscow, which is very, very close to Europe, and there's not a lot of land surrounding Moscow, and then of course south for a warm seaport.
Okay. Well, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine has shown quite a bit of conflict. Would you talk about that for us?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, over the centuries, literally, I think there have been over 50 wars between Russia and Ukraine. And the borders have shifted over time, one way or another. There have been a number of empires that have gotten into Ukraine as well and ruled Ukraine. But the sort of the tension between the Russian people and the Ukrainian people has been a constant over time. But as with many neighbors, there's also a lot of commonalities. The cultures in many ways are similar. The language is not so dissimilar, although it's much different than most people suspect. The religion is in many ways the same. And then of course there's been trade and intermarriage. And so it's a very, very complicated relationship, which is like I said, very common among neighboring countries. And, then there was the Russian Empire, where Russia controlled much of present-day Ukraine. Fast forward to the Soviet Union, where for all except a couple of years, the Soviet Ukraine was a republic in the former Soviet Union. And then there was 1991, when all of the republics became independent countries. And many of the people in this room probably remember that. Probably remember that Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, because we thought, this was it. Countries were going to become democracies, countries were going to become capitalists, and we were going to move forward into a pretty rosy future. And that's not exactly the way everything developed. It became a lot more complicated than that. And as Russia and Ukraine, continued to develop their relationship, it didn't look initially as though it was going to be the hostile relationship that we see right now. There was a lot of, there were a lot of positive developments. Russia, in numerous treaties and agreements and statements, recognized Ukraine as an independent country. recognized the borders, the international borders of Ukraine, and worked with Ukraine on many things, as did the United States, as did NATO, as did Western European countries. And so, the first 10 years after independence were actually fairly positive in terms of relations with Russia, I think, for the West and for the United States, and even for Ukraine. When Putin came to power, he pretty quickly, so just to dip quickly into the domestic part of things, he pretty quickly started consolidating his power. First with the oligarchs, making them into his personal wallets, as they call it in Russia, where they were basically his money launderers and didn't have much independence after a couple of years. And then he went about very methodically cutting down any possible opposition over the next 15 years. So whether it was an independent press, whether it was the opposition, whether it was active civil society, any area that, or group of people that could create an opposition to Putin were pretty summarily cut down to size. Some of them were assassinated, including overseas. So it was a pretty ruthless regime, I would say. And the relationship with Ukraine became increasingly tense. So I can get into where we are right now, or I don't know if you want to.
That would be great. No, I'd be very interested in your comments. If you want to go back maybe to 2014.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to go back a little bit further even. So some of you may remember that in 1999, when President Yeltsin was still in power, he basically had sort of anointed Prime Minister Putin, who was an unknown, to be his successor. And one of the ways that Putin became known to the Russian people, as well as the rest of the world, was he started the Second Chechen War. And Chechnya was a part of Russia. It was an internal war. And he brutally destroyed the capital city of Grozny, killing thousands of people, including thousands of Russians, many of them pensioners. And that's how he started, his swaggering tough guy image, and sort of said, we're going to kill them in the outhouses. And somehow that tapped into something that the Russian people really admired in Putin. And I think, for many of us, it's a little, vulgar and not completely understandable, but it tapped into something, and he won in a landslide. And then the international community really didn't have much to say about what happened in Chechnya. As far as I know, we did not protest the really ruthless and brutal way that war was implemented. And we all just kept on moving on with the relationship with Putin, hoping that it would be a positive relationship with Putin. Then in 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia, another one of the republics that had become an independent state. And Russia grabbed 2 hunks of Georgia. And the international community did comment on it, did criticize the Russians for this, but there were no sanctions were implemented. There was no cost to Russia for invading a neighboring state, none at all. And so Russia sort of absorbed all of that. And then in 2014, Russia invaded Crimea. Within a month, had snatched the whole peninsula, and then started a month later. They started the war in the Donbass, that eastern part of Ukraine. And the international community was much more forceful in its reaction. So we the West, criticized it vehemently. We kicked Russia out of the G8, so it became the G7. These are the 7 largest or 8 largest economies in the world. It's an important organization. And we implemented sanctions. And I don't think that Russia was expecting any of this. And it's my belief, not just my belief, but that Russia stopped where it stopped in the Donbass because of those sanctions. Russia spent the next 8 years fomenting a hot war in the middle of Europe. Because even though the borders, the new borders were, or I should say the line of control or line of contact, if it's not an international border, was relatively well demarcated. There was fighting for the next 8 years, and there were probably 2 to 3 Ukrainians died every week. Soldiers for sure, but also civilians. And the fighting that we see, the most fierce fighting that you're seeing going on right now, it's in that same area. So these poor people have had a war going on for 8 years, and now is with the full force of the Russian military. And during the 8 years, I think that Russia was, turning up the heat when it felt it needed to, and turning it down when it didn't. And it was my belief, including when I was there as ambassador, that that was enough for Russia. That what Russia wanted to do was destabilize Ukraine, so that it would be hard for Ukraine to have an independent foreign policy. It would be hard for Ukraine to have good governance, because there's this war in your country. They used the kinetic war in Donbass, but they also assassinated leaders in Ukraine. There were cyber attacks. Some of them we heard about because there were international ripple effects. I mean, billions of dollars worth of damage internationally. Some of them we didn't. And so Russia was trying to destabilize Ukraine, and I thought that that was going to be enough. I mean, I knew that there would be a confrontation with Russia at some point, but I didn't actually think it was going to be in Ukraine. I thought that the destabilization was enough. And then we saw in the fall of last year, Russia started positioning men and material along the 3 sides of Ukraine, and then finally on the 24th of February, Russia invaded. And so it became clear that their original goal, and again, it's my belief it's still a goal of Putin's, was to invade the whole country and control the whole country. And so that's where we are right now.
Well, thank you. Based on photographs, testimony, and more, and I'm referring to the just incredible bombing and howitzers and so forth, and the rape and just murder of civilians. It appears to me that Putin is almost trying to obliterate Ukraine as a nation.
I mean, it certainly looks that way, and that's what he's done in Grozny and Chechnya, what he's done in Syria. I think it's odd because he started this war talking about the brotherly nation of Ukraine and how the Ukrainians are our brother Slavs, and sort of really talking about the closeness between the 2 people. And now the rhetoric has changed so that it's he's liberating the Ukrainians from the Nazi leadership. But if you look at a lot of Russian language newspapers and other information, they're now talking about the whole country is full of Nazis, and that Ukrainians are really our enemies, and that the Russian military needs to go into Ukraine and save Russia from the Nazis, the Ukrainian people who are trying to attack Russia. And then there's this whole line that the Ukrainians are doing this at the behest of NATO and the United States. I mean, it's a complete fantasy, but and this is the hard part, I think, for some of us to understand, but many people in Russia believe it because that's all they know. That's all they've heard. The Russian propaganda machine is very, very effective. And if you're only watching Russian, Channel 1, the Russian state government's TV, that's what you're hearing. And when Russian soldiers come back from the front in their body bags, they're the little towns where they go back to, people are being told that they're heroes, that they are defending the Russian people from the Nazis in Ukraine. And it's really insidious because it makes it hard to see between that kind of propaganda in Russia and then the brutality of what the Russian military is doing in Ukraine, as you said, raping women, raping men, raping children for that matter. I would say it's indiscriminate bombing, but it's not. It's discriminate bombing of hospitals, of schools, of residential areas, killing people indiscriminately as well. Now we're seeing trials where Russian soldiers are being tried for shooting, people at point blank. Civilians riding on bikes and things like that. It's hard to see the path to peace when you have the hardening, I think, in both cultures, in both countries. My Ukrainian friends, at the beginning of the war, of course, they were upset and mad and all the emotions that you would expect. But after they saw, after some of the cities had been liberated from Russian occupations, after they saw what had happened in Bucha and in other places, that those feelings really turned to real anger and really they became much less willing to compromise on anything because they wanted the deaths of those Ukrainians to count for something. They didn't want to just go back to business as usual with Russia. And so I think you're seeing that reflected in Zelensky's comments, in his leadership style, and in the way that the Ukrainians continue to fight back so passionately.
I'd like to ask you for your views on two articles that were recently published in the New York Times. One of them was today, and it was Thomas Friedman. And Friedman argued that when he was on this side of the Atlantic, he felt that Putin's war was a war against Ukraine. But he's been in Europe for some time now, and he said once he got on the other side of the pond, he came to the conclusion that Putin's war was not just against Ukraine, it was against Europe. And the implication I got out of that was that there was no way to tell just how far Putin would go. How do you feel about that?
I completely agree, and I go even further and say that Putin's war is a war against the international rules-based order. So, just to take the first part about Europe, in the US, of course, we remember World War II, and yesterday, 2 days ago was Memorial Day. We remember those who were lost. We remember the sacrifices of generations before us. And some of you, like me, obviously I didn't live through World War II, but my parents did. And they lived, in autocracies, they lived through the war, and that was their lived experience. But it was my learned experience because, parents pass that sort of stuff on to their children. And so, there are funny little examples of how, my mom couldn't throw anything out. Every rubber band was saved. In my house, every little rubber band is saved. But there's also bigger things, of course, as well, of the lessons of World War II. So I think, some people may remember these things or understand them more viscerally. In Europe, where, of course, the battles of World War II were fought all over Europe, it is very visceral. And you can see, and Tom Friedman talks about this in his really great op-ed, about how, you're just seeing in the space of days and then weeks and months, you're seeing European countries changing their foreign policy of the last 7 decades. And it's because of Russia's aggression. I mean, the ironic thing is Russia had wanted less of NATO, and they're getting more of NATO, with Sweden and Finland putting in their applications to join NATO. Putin wanted to see NATO dissolved, really, basically. He was hoping that some of the lack of purpose and disunity that we've seen over the last few years in NATO, that with a war in Ukraine, he could really divide Europe over many of the fault lines, whether it's over the aggression, whether it's over gas, whether it's over a number of different, whether it's over the implementation of sanctions. And what he found was he united Europe, he united NATO, he united the EU, and he's seeing pushback that he was not expecting. So I think it's because Europeans feel this so viscerally. I think it's because President Biden, who has been at the forefront of probably every major foreign policy decision over the last 40 or 50 years, maybe even 50, who also understands the stakes, and all of these countries can come together under Biden's leadership. But I also think that what Putin is doing is trying to undermine our international rules-based order, because the order, as we call it in our wonky way, just to remind folks, is the sort of the web of institutions and agreements and principles and norms that developed after World War II, when countries in Europe, and that included the Soviet Union, came together and said, never again. We cannot have so much death and so much destruction. And so they enshrined the principles of sovereignty, that nations get to decide how they rule themselves and their alliances. They enshrined the principle of borders, that borders are inviolable, and that you don't settle your problems with your neighbors through the use of force or the threat of the use of force. And so over the decades, the UN was established, the OSCE, the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, they are not perfect, and they probably need to be reformed since we are no longer living in 1946. But they have kept much of the world, more free, more secure, and more prosperous than if we didn't have them. But Russia cannot compete in this kind of an order because, if you think about it, where do refugees go? Where do immigrants go? They're not running to Russia and the opportunities in Russia. They're going to Europe and they're going to the United States and other places because they know where opportunity is. And Russia can only really make its will felt through the use of force and coercion. And so I think that's why it has chosen the instrument of war. And if Russia is successful in Ukraine, I don't think it will be, but if Russia is successful in Ukraine, we can expect to see in several more years, Russia will absorb whatever part of Ukraine it has, and we can expect Russia to continue pushing, because that's been the pattern. Chechnya, Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine in 2022. There's no reason to think that if Russia absorbs a part of Ukraine, the Donbass, say, that it will be satisfied with that, because that's not been the history. And Putin has told us, on the eve of this war, he told us that he was already looking further west at other countries that needed to be brought back into the fold of Mother Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of writing also where Putin himself, but those who speak for him, criticize the international order. So I think if he prevails here, not only can we see more military action from Russia, but I think other autocrats are going to be emboldened because they're seeing that Russia's successful, So why can't they solve their problems in the same way? And I think it will be a much less secure, much less free, and certainly much less prosperous world if Russia gets away with this.
Thank you. The other question from the other article that I read, I'd like to combine it with another question that I have for you. And the other question that I have for you is, are we doing enough to aid Ukraine in its situation? But put that together with an article that was in the Times on the op-ed section maybe 3 days ago. And the title was, based on a book that some of you might have read, Sleepwalking into World War I. The title of this article was, Are We Sleepwalking into War with Russia?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. And I think the answer is no. But I think one shouldn't dismiss the question either, just because I think the answer is no. And I think we need to keep on testing ourselves on this hypothesis, because the stakes are very, very high. So first of all, I would say that, in my opinion, President Biden is doing a really good job in a really, really difficult set of circumstances. He is navigating this very, very narrow lane of trying to support Ukraine, trying to deter Russia, and trying to strengthen the eastern flank of NATO, those frontline countries like Poland, without broadening the war, without having us through a mistake or or a deliberate act getting us into a broader war, because nobody wants a war between NATO and Russia. Nobody wants a war between the United States and Russia. That's clear. But when dealing with a man like Putin, he is a bully. And if he's not stopped, he's going to keep on going. And I think that's what the last 20 plus years of Putin's leadership has shown. He was able to get away with it in Georgia and Ukraine the first time. And if he gets away with it again, he's going to keep on going. So there is risk in not doing enough. But there's also risk in taking actions, right? And so we have, I'm sure, thousands, well maybe not thousands, but many, many lawyers in Washington trying to figure out what would be considered provocative, what is right according to our rules and laws and regulations and so forth in terms of the actions that we're taking. But here's the thing. Putin has already told us that he considers us levying sanctions on Russia to be an act of war. So just because we decide that a particular action is not provocative to Russia doesn't mean that Russia or Putin is going to agree with that. So we need to make our own analyses and make our own decisions as to what level of risk we are willing. We, the U.S., we, NATO, we, the West, are willing to absorb. And that's a tough one. It is very, very hard. And I think what we've seen since February, not only did we see European countries changing their foreign policy overnight, but we've also seen our own policy and the policy of other countries, whether it's on sanctions, whether it's on providing security assistance, change very rapidly. Providing equipment and systems that would have been, frankly, unthinkable 2 weeks prior, and all of a sudden here we are. And we've just seen yesterday the latest move with longer range missiles going to being approved to go to Ukraine, so that the Ukrainians will have offset and be able to launch missiles up to about 50 miles. So it's, that hopefully will be a game changer in the Donbass. But that was the subject of a lot of debate. Many people in Washington thought that that was too risky a thing to do because, it could go, those weapons could reach into Russia. But the fact of the matter is other weapons could reach into Russia as well. And so I think the compromise that was worked out is that the Ukrainians said that they would not use these weapons to go into Russia, which is what we did back when I was ambassador with the very first Javelin shipment. There were caveats on how they could be used. And so there are caveats on how these newest weapons can be used as well. So, it's tough. I mean, there's risk in acting, there's risk in not acting boldly enough. And I think that this is an administration that is giving deep thought to these actions. So, not saying that everything they do is perfect, but I don't think they're sleepwalking.
Very good, I'm glad to hear that. A friend of mine called me up and asked me to ask you this question based on a quote from the Lakeville Journal. And this quote was, you said that if Putin gave the military an order it refused to obey, and I quote, he would be toast. The question is, who would be toast? Putin? Is that who you meant?
That's who I meant.
Okay, and following that up, some of my friends have told me that, although it's just hearsay, they think that Putin has been carrying around with him doctors for a number of years and that he has some form of cancer. Is there any reason to believe that?
Well, he certainly has, the puffy face that would be characteristic of certain kinds of treatments for cancer. But he's also older than he was before, and so some of us gain weight when we get older, and maybe he's one of them. He is a man who has taken really good care of himself. So for a Russian man, I think, I could be wrong on this, but I want to say that the average, actually I don't want to say, but he is well past his expiration point. But he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink. I'm sure he eats, properly, and he's known to be a fanatic about exercise. So he is probably about as healthy as he can be if he doesn't have cancer. The rumor about him having cancer has been out there for a number of years. He's said to be, is said to travel with 2 specialists everywhere he goes. I don't think we really know for sure. If I could just add one other thing, I just saw today a really interesting set of tweets from Navalny, who is a Russian opposition leader in the Gulag right now as we speak. His chief of staff was commenting on this rumor, and he said, it's really important that, if it's true or if it isn't, that Putin is brought to justice. Because if he dies of cancer, somewhere in some, palace, no doubt, Putinism will continue. There will be the revanchists. Putin needs to be brought to justice. He needs to be held accountable for his many crimes. That is the only way that the Russian people are going to rid themselves of, not just Putin, but Putinism. And I thought that was actually a very interesting comment. Now, clearly, a political opponent of Putin's, but nevertheless, I thought that there was something to what he said.
That's very interesting. Politicians of all sorts who commit crimes need to be brought to justice. I won't go any further with that one. Masha, thank you so much for your comments. I'd like to turn to your incredibly compelling memoir. I was just so moved by every page, so well written, so dramatic, so personal. Are there any Princeton, this sounds crazy, any Princeton graduates in this room? Hold your hand up. Okay, well, the few of you here will know what I'm about to do, which is to show everybody else what you already have seen in your Princeton Alumni Weekly, which is that Masha, for her accomplishments in diplomacy and for her book, got on the cover. And really, it was a wonderful review of your book, as it should have been. I'm curious, what led you to write the book?
Well, I'll answer that question, but first I just need to tell you that, in my class of 1980, if there had been a poll of who was least likely to be the cover girl this year, it would have been me. I was definitely not a star at Princeton, and it was sort of years after I graduated, when my Russian professors would proudly visit me at my various posts and things like that. I think they were always sort of bemused that somehow I had managed, to get a job and keep a job and be pretty good at the job. So, I mean, that's for, everybody out there who maybe wasn't a star in college, but you can be afterwards. Now I dove into that rabbit hole. Why did I write the book?
Yes.
Yes, why did I write the book? So I never thought I was going to write a book, any book at all. But after I testified publicly in 2019, I knew that my career at the State Department was over. And so I was, kind of reluctantly making plans to retire. And I didn't know what I was going to do next. But I got hundreds and actually thousands of letters from people all over the United States saying, we want to hear more about you. We want to hear more about the State Department. We want to hear more about the Foreign Service. Write a book. And so, as I thought about it, and since I didn't have any other plans, I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book. And so that was the genesis.
Very good. The title of your book, Lessons from the Edge. I have a possible idea of what you meant by the edge, but I'd like to hear what you say about that. What do you mean?
Well, it has many different meanings. As I was writing the book, in some ways the title actually came almost before the book, but as I was writing the book, there were more and more meanings. So, our family, we were immigrants to the United States, and we settled in the lovely bucolic town of Kent, Connecticut. But we were, my mom was from Germany after World War II. My father was from Russia during the Cold War, and we were in the little town of Kent, Connecticut, where it seemed to us that everybody was a wasp. And so it felt like we were a little bit on the edge of that community. Then I'm an introvert, and a pretty strong introvert. And so, the way I manage that is by listening, by not, jumping into conversations, by sitting on the edge of the at the edge of the table or at the edge of the group and listening to other people, and then maybe making a couple of comments. And so, much of certainly in my early years, and even now, I'm not the one who is, the one who's talking the most, except for tonight. Then when I joined the Foreign Service, I felt so fortunate to join the Foreign Service. It was, our parents raised my brother and me to really appreciate democracy and freedom, and to make us, and they made us understand how lucky we were that we had found a home in the United States, and that we needed to give back because we were fortunate. And so, the State Department was my way of marrying up, my love of history and foreign policy that Larry instilled in me, and a way of giving back, of serving the American people. But, I joined the State Department in 1986, and some of you may remember that was not a time when women were really encouraged to be diplomats. There were no role models. Many, kind of openly talked about how women couldn't be real Foreign Service officers, couldn't be real political officers, certainly not if you're married. That was kind of accepted. And for the women who were coming into the State Department at that point, it was some tough sledding, and you really had to prove yourself. And because we changed jobs every 2 to 3 years and moved from embassy to embassy, you're proving yourself every 2 to 3 years because you're working with different people, at least in the beginning of your career. So it was tough sledding, and I felt I was really on the edge of that career, and wasn't really sure that this was the career for me for a while. And then, when the Soviet Union fell apart, My first tour was in Somalia, which was the edge of the world. And then I ended up serving in many different places in the former Soviet Union, places like Kyrgyzstan, which are probably the most beautiful country in the world, but also very, very remote. And we used to say that it's not the edge of the world, but you can see it from there. And there were a lot of places like that. Just to jump back to Somalia, 1986, that was before the internet and social media and email and all of that stuff. And so the way I communicated with family and friends in the United States was by letters. You remember those? And it took 3 months for a round trip for the letter, for me to send a letter and for me to get a response. It was remote. It was on the edge.
Well, to follow up on your comment about the State Department, in your book you amusingly refer to it when you joined as Pale, Male, and Yale. By the time you retired from the State Department, to what extent had it improved?
It's improved a lot. But there's still a ways to go. And one of the ways I know this is not only my younger colleagues tell me about various incidents or things that need to change, but the Biden administration, not just in the State Department but throughout, has really tried hard to put women in key positions as well as other minorities. And so I'm often, the preface to the question you just asked me is often, they'll name the 3 people on the 7th floor being where the Secretary of State has his office, and people on the 7th floor are his closest advisors, the most senior people. And they'll name 3 women that are on that floor, and they'll say, see, so since these people are in office, things must have changed. And the point to me is that, first of all, 3 people does not a change make. But the second thing is that if we're even commenting on the fact that there are women in senior leadership positions, clearly there hasn't been enough change. This should be, we are over 50% of the population. This should be standard stuff and not something, I do want to give the Biden administration props for doing this, but it shouldn't, that's not what it should take. A big search to find people who are qualified for this job. That means that we don't have a pipeline coming up of the best and the brightest, and we need to make sure we do better.
Right. In your ambassadorships in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia and Ukraine, you describe a very similar approach to reforms in each of those nations, particularly reform of corruption, cutting back corruption, and instilling more democracy. To what extent did the leaders of these nations cooperate with you?
Yeah. So, at least as far as I know, prior to about, at least in my own career, I was in Ukraine from 2001 to 2004 as the number 2. And then I was in Ukraine 2016 to 2019 as the ambassador. And it was really only in that second tour in my career that we were very focused on corruption. I was in Somalia, a very corrupt country that arguably affected our policies and our standing in that nation. Certainly the same thing was true in Kyrgyzstan when I was ambassador there. But we really didn't have a focus on corruption the way we do, I think, now. That if there's corruption in a country, and when I say corruption, I mean not only the big corruption where the leader of the country is stealing millions and billions, if there's enough to go around, and sharing with his closest friends and allies, because that's the only way he can stay in power. But because those countries don't provide services to their populations, because the money that would go to paying doctors, paying teachers, fixing the roads, making sure there's good medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's all being stolen. And so there aren't the kinds of services that people need and expect. And so people within the country are also corrupt. It's called petty corruption. But if they need a water line put in on their farm, they'll find somebody who can do that for them from the water substation, and they'll pay them a little bribe to get it done, and rather than having to wait 3 years for their turn, because who's going to wait 3 years? The cattle are going to be dead by then. And so it's corruption is the grease that kind of makes countries with a lack of governance, not even poor governance, just a lack of governance. That's the grease that makes things work, because people are going to find a way. And corruption was one of the legacies, the malign legacies of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union didn't work, and then all these countries in 1991 became independent, and they didn't change overnight just because they were independent. The heads of each of the republics, had studied in Moscow. They had, they were probably not true believers in communism, but they continued to govern the way they had governed before. And so the corruption just continued. And I think we, somewhat naively looking back on it, we worked with these countries starting from 1991 on, they came to us. They asked us and other Western countries to help them, write a new constitution that would reflect democracy and market and capitalism, and help them establish a market economy and democracy in their countries. And we were very happy to help, because we thought that it was good for those countries, that these were not perfect systems, but better systems than the rest, and that countries that are stable and prosperous, which we believe would come as a result of capitalism and democracy, would be better partners for the United States, that we would have more steadfast partners, and so that was good for us. But we didn't really tackle the idea of corruption, I don't think, really in a meaningful way until 2014 in Ukraine. And the reason that we did that was because of the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people staged massive demonstrations in 2013, 2014. And it started because Yovanovitch, the president at the time, who was very, very corrupt, it's estimated that he and his cronies stole $40 billion from Ukraine. I mean, that's a lot of money. That Yovanovitch had, negotiated, I mean, his staff had negotiated a closer association with the EU. And Ukrainians were really in favor of that, because they didn't see it as a political thing. They saw it as an economic thing. They saw it as a way to open up the EU countries for Ukrainians who wanted to work in the West, who wanted to do trade and commerce with the West, students thought that they could, they knew that they would be able to study in the West. And so this was a very popular move. But Putin put a lot of pressure on Yovanovitch, and oh, by the way, also gave Ukraine, but read Yovanovitch, a $15 billion loan, $3 billion of which was paid in around November, December of 2013. And that money disappeared, funnily enough. So, but what happened in November of 2013 is that a bunch of college students went to the Maidan, the square in the center of Ukraine, and protested. And Yovanovitch, true to his nature, cracked down on them hard. And there was a journalist, an investigative journalist called Mustafa Nayem. He's an Afghan, actually, by ethnicity, but this just goes to show that Ukraine really is a multi-ethnic country. Mustafa sort of put on Facebook, let's go down to the square and support our students. You know, what's going on here? And every day there were just more and more people until there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street in the winter of 2014. And eventually, the Ukrainians prevailed, and Yovanovitch fled the country with all of his money. But what the name of that revolution became the revolution of dignity. And what that meant to Ukrainians was, I want to be treated with dignity. I want there to be a rule of law, not a rule of man, where everybody is treated the same, where I don't have to pay bribes. And so there was an interim government, and then Poroshenko came to power as the president of Ukraine. He was the first president to win in only one round, which was considered very significant, very unifying for Ukraine. And he came in, although he was one of the oligarchs, one of the 6 major oligarchs, he came in on a platform of anti-corruption. And Ukraine was, of course, broke at that point because Yovanovitch had stolen all the money. And the international community came in to help Ukraine. But what we said was, we are going to help you, but we are going to put conditions on our assistance. And so that was the assistance, the programs, the reform platform that Poroshenko was going to implement, how he was going to tackle corruption, was negotiated with civil society activists, the people who had been on the street, many of whom were, lawyers and management consultants who had come back from the West to, help their country, on the street, and then stayed to help with governance. Reformers in the government, and then the international community. And so it was actually pretty inspiring that, all of those groups were able to come together and put together a platform where a lot of change was made in a relatively short time. It was hard, it was really difficult. The first government collapsed in a year and a half because change is really hard, but they made progress, and they continue to make progress even in later years. But every year it becomes harder because what I would call the old Ukraine, came back. The oligarchs, those who had a stake in the old ways of doing things. Every time you make a reform, every time you pass a new law or put in a new regulation, somebody's rice bowl is being broken. And people tend not to like that. And so they started to put roadblocks in the way, and reform got harder, which led to Zelensky's election. He won with 73% of the vote. He had 2 points he made with no detail at all. The first was, I'm going to end the war. The second was, I'm going to end corruption. And that was enough for the people of Ukraine because he had a lot of standing as a comedian and an actor. They felt they knew him, and they gave him 73% of the vote. He now, when the war started on February 23rd, February 24th, he was down in the 30s. It's tough going being president, really hard to make change. But now he's got 94% popularity rating, which I don't think would surprise anybody here. It makes me wonder who the other 6% are.
Thank you. I have other questions for you, but I think it's very important for us to have the audience ask questions to you. But I do want to say congratulations to you, Masha, for your admirable work as an ambassador and in other positions in the State Department. You are a role model for others, especially in your diplomatic skill, your integrity, and your optimism. It has been and continues to be an honor to work with you. Thank you, Masha.
What do you think of Henry Kissinger's idea that in order to allow Putin to save face, Ukraine should secede some of the Donbass territory to him? just related to that, in the 40 years that maybe you've been doing diplomacy, how has it changed? And what are the skill sets needed to be an effective diplomat these days?
Thank you. So, there's a kind of a realist school of foreign policy, and Henry Kissinger is probably the biggest proponent and the biggest example of that, where we just need to be hard-headed about what our national security interests are, and kind of hew to that. And I think his view is that we can't get bogged down in Ukraine because we have bigger fish to fry with China, and Russia is the greater power. And so, often realists, when they talk about great power politics, what they talk about is what is the stable equilibrium, where there will be, peace, if not, for all time, at least for our time, right? And again, there's something to that argument, right? And our policies usually are a combination of our interests and our values, and ideally the two always are the same, but often they're not. And so, how do we find that right balance and so forth? And I think what he's suggesting is that, like I said, that Ukraine, as a smaller, weaker power, needs to be realistic about what's happening and offer up, some concessions. And what I've noted is that there have been negotiations. Sorry. I hope I didn't do that. So you can see I'm about to disagree, right? Sorry about that. What I've noticed is that, can you hear me? Yeah. I don't want to put it too close to my mouth because I think that's what must have happened. Is that there have been negotiations between Russia and Ukraine since almost the beginning of the war, starting on February 24th. And Zelensky put a lot on the table, including, kind of floating the idea of territorial concessions. But the Russians were never serious, I think, in the view of most, about negotiations. They didn't send their A-team out to begin with. That's always a sign. Zelensky did. And there was just kind of footsie going back and forth, no real hard discussions. And I think for those of us who have watched Russia for a long time, this is a standard ploy where you're saying you're negotiating and you're eating up the time as you're hoping that the war is going to go in your favor and the facts on the ground are going to favor you in the ultimate negotiations. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Russia, especially as Russia is incrementally gaining more ground in the Donbass. They have no interest in negotiating right now. But I think the other thing is that after Bucha, as I mentioned before, there was a hardening among the Ukrainian people because they could not see, and cannot at this point, see their way to giving up land, making concessions to Russia when this is the way the Russian people have treated their countrymen. They want to make those sacrifices count. And Ukraine is not a perfect country, but it is a democracy. And Zelensky knows that. And he has said that he will put whatever, in the final analysis, and I think just in the last day or so, he said, this war is going to end with negotiations, right, with diplomacy. That's why all wars end in the end. But he will put whatever agreement comes out of that to the Ukrainian people in a referendum. And that is going to be tricky given where the Ukrainian people are right now. And so one of the questions I have is, all agreements at the end of the day involve some sort of compromise, whether it's land or whether it's something else. And, is Zelensky, as the president of the people, is he going to be able to, I hate to use the word sell, but convince the Ukrainian people that these are the compromises that are worth making in the end. But here's the other thing that I think, the Ukrainian people have already decided, and I think Zelensky is right there with the Ukrainian people. I mean, I just don't see it. I don't think that Russia will be satisfied with taking all of the Donbass. I think Russia will take it, sign the agreement, and do just what they did in 2014, 2015, with the agreements that were signed between Poroshenko and Putin, that, although they didn't personally sign them, but the agreements that were made between those two. And then Russia never implements those agreements. I think that's exactly what we're gonna see. We're gonna see a consolidation, a regrouping, a rearming, and then in a couple of years, Putin will push further west. Given the history of what we've seen in Putin's reign, I don't see him being satisfied with just a couple little concessions here and there. That's just not the way he's made. And I think that's the ultimate realist argument. But here's the other thing, and this is, the values argument. Who are we to tell the Ukrainians who are fighting and dying for, their country, their families, their freedoms, going back to the op-eds that you were talking about, Tom Friedman was talking about, fighting for our freedom. Who are we to tell them that they should, concede and make the war stop so that we can keep on enjoying Russian gas? Because that's what it comes down to, and focusing on other things. The Ukrainian people have told us, Zelensky has said, that they're ready to fight and die for their country and for us, and all they want is our support. And frankly, I think we should give it to them.
Earlier you mentioned that there were certain caveats to how the Ukrainians could use weapons that we sent them overseas.
I'm sorry, I can't see you. Could I ask you something? And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself too?
My name is Joseph Brennan. I'm a senior here at Uzi.
All right.
Earlier you mentioned that there were certain caveats to the weapons that we sent Ukrainians. How did we reach that level of trust with the Ukrainian government and continue that level of trust without American boots on the ground certifying that they are actually using the weapons in that way?
Well, are you talking about the javelins now?
Well, just in general, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
We had certified to send missiles over to
Right.
Ukraine.
So back with the javelins and the first time, so the Obama administration refused to send javelins to Russia because, I'm sorry, to Ukraine, because I think it was felt at the most senior levels that this would be provocative to Russia. Over time, President Trump, in a strengthening of our policy towards Ukraine, agreed to send the first shipment of javelins at the end of 2017, and they arrived in 2018. And we had, every embassy has representatives of the U.S. military in it, so we have what's called a defense attaché office. And so the Army representatives were, in there working that with their counterparts in the Ukrainian military. Where are they going to be stored? How are you going to store them? How do you know that it's going to be secured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it was that old Slavic saying, trust but verify. And we had very strong relations with the Ukrainian military, especially strong after 2014. And so we were quite confident about the use. I think now, I don't exactly know how the conversation on, the caveats that this would not be used, against Russian targets in Russia. I don't know how that was reached, but here's the thing. The Ukrainians are, we've seen how ferociously they're fighting because they know why they're fighting. They're fighting for their freedom and they have to win. But they can't do it without our help. And I think they will abide by our, call it a request, that they not target Russian targets with our weapons. Because if they do, we will know, and there will be a push to stop supplying Ukraine. And they can't afford that. They simply cannot afford that. They need the supply of weapons to continue to Ukraine from us, as well as from the other 40 plus countries that are supplying Ukraine. it is essential or Ukraine will lose. So I think that's what it comes down to.
I'd like to ask you a question concerning the,
And could you tell me your name too?
I'm sorry?
Could you identify yourself, please?
Michael Cesaro Sr. You met my son yesterday.
Nice to meet you.
The Russian Orthodox hierarchy gave the blessing to Putin.
Yeah.
How do the people of Russia feel about that, or is that giving them more credence in this war?
So I think that this goes back to how successfully Putin has tapped into, the myths and the longings of the Russian people. The idea of, Putin, when he came into office in 2000, Russia, that was 10 years of independence. And while things were going pretty well from our point of view, I think, because Russia was not an enemy and we were doing our best to bring Russia into the international fold, I think many Russians saw all of that as deeply humiliating. That Russia was no longer, the other superpower, and Putin was able to tap into that from the very beginning. With his tough guy stance on Chechnya, with some of the other things he did, and with his, use and abuse, really, of the Russian Orthodox Church, bringing it in as part of the panoply of making Russia great again, and hearkening back, to the Tsars and all of that. That really appealed to the Russian people in terms of the grandeur of its history and of its past. And Putin was implicitly promising that there would be a future to all of that as well. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And because he controls pretty much all the conduits of information, he's able to do that, and he's able to tell the Russian people that they're fighting the Nazis, tapping into the World War II history where, for Russians and frankly all of that part of the world, they suffered incredible losses during World War II. And it is a part of every Russian family, lost somebody during World War II. And that was the fight against the fascists, against the German fascists. And Putin has kind of appropriated that history for what he's doing now in Ukraine, very cleverly. And I think the Russian Orthodox Church is a part of that, and I think the Russian people accept that.
Over here.
My name is Tonya Shumatov, and I am a student of your father's from Kent School, and I became a Russian major in college. And my thesis was called Doom or Democracy, about Russia. And I want to ask you, going back to when the Soviet Union collapsed, 1991-ish, there was some hope, it seemed, that democracy might be embraced. In the beginning, that there was excitement in Russia about having freedom, having democracy. Why is it, and it seems that the individual versus the state has historically been persecuted, the individual in Russia, going back to the Tsars. Why is it that Ukraine was able to be successful in embracing democracy, but Russia was not?
Yeah, that is a really, a really good question. I think there is, the Russian people are more, as you noted, more collectivists, whereas Ukrainians are more individualists, and, they are, kind of a wild, unruly bunch that don't want anybody to tell them what to do, whereas Russians, accept being told what to do. And I think that, while 70 years of communism had stamped out much of civil society, because everything had to be done through the Communist Party. So there was a chess club, but it was the Communist Party's chess club. There were the equivalent of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, pioneers they were called, but it was run through the Communist Party because you wouldn't, in the Soviet era, you wouldn't want any independent clubs or anything else where some sort of independent thought might actually jump out in people's minds and they could organize and something bad might happen. And so that had been stamped out in Ukraine, but civil society started emerging by the late 1990s in Ukraine. And which isn't to say that it wasn't emerging in Russia, but it was slower and not quite as, there wasn't as much fertile ground, shall we say. And then, Putin came to power, and he is ruthless, and he started stamping it out pretty quickly. But in Ukraine, it continued. And so some of you may recall the Orange Revolution in 2004, which again was demonstrations in the streets because there was a fiddled election. Putin had actually come in and campaigned for the pro-Russian candidate, and then congratulated him before the vote was counted. People knew that that candidate had not won, and they took to the streets. And there was a burgeoning, journalist class of people, investigative reporters that were finding out about corruption and, putting it out there for the people to see. It was, it was slow, but civil society took root. And, when I left in 2004, you could see that it was strong and active. When I came back in 2016, I couldn't believe it. It was, the people were leading and politicians had to fall in line, basically. So, when you think about stamping out of corruption after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, that was the people telling politicians what they wanted, and politicians realizing they had to at least give lip service to it. They had to have at least some accomplishments in this lane, or they would not get elected. And I think you're seeing it again now with Zelensky, where he knows that if he acquiesces to the calls from certain quarters to just compromise, end the dying and the killing. This is terrible. He knows that, first of all, he's not going to stay in power, and that it's just not going to work. And that's coming from the Ukrainian people. I'm not saying it's not coming from Zelensky too, but he has to, as a president in a democratic country, he has to take that into account. So that doesn't really answer the question. I think there's going to be a lot of study into this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moscow Shell. My question goes back to your work as a diplomat and ambassador. I wonder whether you could give us an example of the best or perhaps the most difficult negotiation that you took place during your career and why.
Well, I can, but usually there's kind of a lot of detail involved. But I'll give you one example, which I actually also write about in the book. So when I arrived in 2016, our policy, Ukraine's policy, and certainly what the people wanted, was to put a focus on anti-corruption. And in many ways, policy is people, right? You can have a great policy, but if you've got a terrible person at the head of an organization or at the head of a company, that policy is probably not going to be implemented. It's not, if it is, it's not going to be implemented well. And Ukraine had a gas company called Naftogaz. It was a state-owned company, and it was run by a guy named Andrei Kovalyev, who was young and arrogant and clean. And he, by the time I got there, he had already, Ukraine had, in 2014, I think Ukraine imported something like over 90% of its natural gas from Russia. This was after Russia had twice turned off the taps during the wintertime to Ukraine. So you would think that the leadership of a country would be interested in developing some independence. But that had not happened because there was a pro-Russian person in charge, Yovanovitch. So When I arrived 2 years after the Revolution of Dignity, Kobayev had turned natural gas around, and by the 3 months later, I think Ukraine was only importing something like 6% of its gas from Ukraine. I could be wrong on that figure, but it was a dramatic reversal. And he had put in many other reforms as well. But as I said before, every time you put in a reform, you're breaking somebody's rice bowl. And the thing about, why is there always, so much focus on gas lines and all of that? Well, the reason is that's where the money is. So that's where the corruption is too. And the gas industry in Ukraine was very, very corrupt. And one of the things that they were trying to do to put that industry in harmony with the EU, so that when they ultimately had a closer association with the EU, it would be easier to harmonize all the regulations and laws, was to basically break apart the many constituent parts of this big gas monopoly. And one of them was the transmission lines. And so I had been in Ukraine for about 3 weeks or something like that. I'd only met the prime minister once. And I got this call over the weekend that the prime minister and the minister of energy were pulling a fast one, and they were changing the way this transmission company was going to be governed, and it was going to go under the very corrupt Minister of Energy, and this would be a huge problem for 2 reasons. Number one, it was to further corruption and to take it away from making it clean in the naphtha gas way, and keep it as a little hub of corruption for those who were milking it dry. But the second thing was that I mentioned before that when we provided assistance, we put conditions on our assistance. And so one of the conditions of our assistance, and not just ours, but the World Bank's, the IMF's, and a couple of other entities, was that the way the cleaning of this transmission company had to go about and the way it needed to be restructured. So I'd been there 3 weeks. I could barely find my way, around the embassy. Had met the prime minister once, and it was this huge crisis. So I call him on a Sunday night, and I'm kind of stumbling around in Russian that I hadn't really used for many years. And I'm telling him, basically, you need to stop this. And if you don't, $1 billion of US money is on the line. And I can't speak for all these other entities, but it's going to be more than that. And oh, by the way, this is the end of our fiscal year, and so we had like days to get this deal done and back into where it needed to be. So we worked feverishly on this for the next couple days, and then I, as well as several others, was invited to kind of a rump cabinet meeting of the Ukrainian government, and I'm sitting there, and everybody looks to me, because I'm the American ambassador and Americans lead. And I'm thinking, I just got here. I'm the person in the room who knows least about this. Why am I the one who has to do this? But okay, so I manned up, and I started talking. And so we're going through this, and the prime minister is very, very smooth. And he said, so the conversation was in English and in Ukrainian, and I don't speak Ukrainian, so it was through an interpreter. And the prime minister at the end of the meeting said, through the interpreter, we're gonna suspend this ruling. And I'm like looking at him and I'm thinking, what does that mean? Was this a translation error? Because he has to cancel it. And so, I said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, I don't know, maybe it's a translation error, but did you mean suspend or did you mean cancel? And we look at each other for it felt like minutes, but I'm sure it was, 5 seconds. And he goes, oh, I meant cancel. And that, And that paved the way for doing what needed to be done with the subsidiary of this gas company, as well as getting the funds unlocked for Ukraine that Ukraine needed in order to move forward in other ways. But it was a very kind of dramatic way for me to start my ambassadorship, because generally I don't. I'll just be honest, I would rather have, tough conversations behind closed doors and nobody ever knows about them, and, everything is, smooth and happy on the outside for all parties. But this, there were a lot of people in the room from a lot of different entities, Ukrainian as well as foreign, and it quickly became public knowledge. And in some ways, perhaps it was good for me because I developed this, tough guy kind of image in Ukraine, but it was also a really hard way to start important relationships with key individuals that you need to keep on working with. So I don't know if that gives you a sense of, both the good and the bad of it.
Thank you. Larry, I think you had something you wanted to say in conclusion, is that correct?
Well, actually, it's what I had said as we finished. I
okay.
congratulated.
Well, I have something to say.
Oh, okay.
So I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, because as you heard, these are my stomping grounds, and so I am really thrilled to be here tonight. And I'm especially thrilled to be here with Larry, who, as you heard, inspired my love of history and the Foreign Service. And, my wish would be for, all the students at Housatonic, I know we have one, maybe we have more, to all have teachers like Larry Rand.
So we thank you both so much for joining us. We couldn't be more delighted to have you here. And thank you, Marie, for your unbelievable service to our country.
One more thing, please. As many of you know, Mary Oppenheimer has come to the end of her term as a board member of the Salisbury Forum and as president. My name is Pat Jenny. I'm going to become the president of Salisbury Forum in a couple of weeks. But on the behalf of 12 of my other board member colleagues, we just want to recognize very quickly the extraordinary contributions of Mary Close Oppenheimer. She has led this organization as president for 4 years. She is leaving the forum in very good shape. We have been able to, finishing up now a year of providing very timely and fascinating programs, capped off by this extraordinary evening with Ambassador Yovanovitch. She is also leaving behind a very solid fiscal situation and a very engaged board of members who are very eager to engage in the future of the forum. Mary, as everybody knows, has guided the forum through the 2.5 years of the pandemic. She engineered the transition to programs and meetings on Zoom webinars. And she also engaged every member of this board to stand up and contribute, and in many situations helped us reach consensus, which, as any of you know who has served on the board, is not the easiest task. And along with her husband, Philip, Mary has also been very, very gracious in opening up her home when COVID allowed for us to have a couple of our meetings there. We are all going to miss Mary, but we're very, very curious about how she will redeploy this freed up time she's going to have in many other ways that will help make this very special community of Northwest corner of Connecticut even better. So join me again in thanking her.